Before dawn, the fort is already awake, not facing outward toward an enemy fleet, but inward, toward the land it claims to control. Cannon muzzles sit cold and dark, angled not at invading armies, but at fields, roads, and human beings who are legally defined as property. Armed men pace the walls. Chains scrape stone. Orders are issued in low, practiced voices. This is not a plantation. This is a garrison. And what it defends is not a border, but a system. This is a first truth about slavery that is rarely taught. It was never passive. It was never maintained by tradition or social agreement alone. It survived because it was enforced continuously, deliberately, and violently by organized force. The version most people learn in school is stripped down, sanitized, and dangerously incomplete. Slavery is presented as a moral failure corrected by enlightened ideas, speeches, and laws, a system that simply faded once people realized it was wrong. But history, when examined through records, military deployments, budgets, and casualty lists, tells a far colder story. Slavery endured for thousands of years because it functioned like a permanent internal war. And like any war, it demanded manpower, weapons, logistics, discipline, and constant vigilance. From the earliest large-scale slave societies, this reality was obvious to those in power. In ancient Rome, enslaved people did not form a marginal workforce. They were the backbone of the economy, and they outnumbered free citizens in some regions. Roman law reflected fear, not confidence. Any gathering of enslaved men was treated as a potential mutiny. Movement was restricted. Arms were forbidden. And when revolt came, it was not handled by local police or magistrates. Legions were deployed. The Spartacus uprising was not a riot. It was a multi-year military campaign that forced Rome to divert experienced commanders and tens of thousands of troops. Entire regions were destabilized. Supply lines were threatened. Roman roads, the arteries of imperial power, became liabilities. When the revolt was finally crushed, the response was surgical and symbolic. Thousands were executed publicly along major routes, not to punish, but to deter. The message was unmistakable. Resistance would be met with overwhelming force. That pattern repeated across history. In Greece, in Carthage, in Persia, and later across the Islamic world in medieval Europe, slavery persisted only where armed dominance could be maintained. The moment control weakened, revolt followed. And those revolts were not anomalies. They were expected. Slave systems were designed with the assumption of constant internal threat. This is where the myth begins to break apart. Slavery was not stable. It was brittle, and maintaining it required extraordinary levels of coercion. By the early modern period, this reality had only intensified. As European powers expanded overseas, slavery transformed into something even more complex, a global, militarized supply chain. Ships were redesigned not for cargo efficiency, but for control. Narrow decks, low ceilings, barricaded compartments. Choke points where armed crews could contain uprisings. The crews themselves were often heavily armed, drilled to respond instantly to resistance. These were not merchant vessels in any normal sense. They were floating prisons. The economics of slavery revealed the same truth. Insurance records treated enslaved people as cargo, but the premiums reflected risk. Not storms or piracy alone, but rebellion. Mutiny was expected. Losses were calculated. Violence was priced in. On land, the infrastructure expanded further. Patrol systems emerged, not as ad hoc measures, but as permanent forces. Routes were mapped, signals established, informant networks cultivated, curfews enforced, weapons caches maintained. In many regions, the men tasked with enforcing slavery trained more frequently than frontier militias or border guards. Their mission was clear: suppress internal threats before they could organize. This was not accidental. It was doctrine. Every major slave society developed its own version of counterinsurgency. Collective punishment was common, not because of cruelty alone, but because it was effective. Food control, movement restrictions, forced separation of families, all served a strategic purpose: prevent coordination, prevent trust, prevent the emergence of leaders. And yet, resistance never stopped. It began quietly. Tools sabotage, crops ruined at critical moments, fires set where they could not be easily traced, intelligence passed in whispers. These acts rarely appear in textbooks because they do not fit neat narratives. But they mattered. They forced responses. They increased costs. They hardened attitudes and expanded enforcement. Each act of resistance was answered with more patrols, harsher laws, and greater militarization. This created a cycle. Resistance provoked repression. Repression provoked adaptation. Over time, slavery became less a labor system and more a security problem. This is a second truth rarely taught. Slavery did not persist because it was accepted. It persisted because fear outweighed conscience and force outweighed opposition, until it no longer could. The Atlantic slave system, often discussed purely in economic terms, is perhaps the clearest example. Plantations were not open farms. They were fortified zones. Watchtowers were common. Armories were maintained. Drills were conducted. In some colonies, laws required white males to serve in patrols for a set number of days per month, regardless of profession. This was not civic duty. It was internal defense. The numbers alone explain why. In many regions, enslaved populations vastly outnumbered the free. Every night carried risk. Every harvest season was a vulnerability. Every gathering was watched. And yet, despite all this force, control was never absolute. Runaways formed communities in swamps, mountains, and forests, areas difficult to penetrate with conventional troops. These groups learned the terrain intimately. They practiced ambush. They avoided open confrontation. They targeted supply lines and isolated patrols. Colonial authorities responded with expeditions that resembled military campaigns, complete with scouts, trackers, and search-and-destroy tactics. These were not isolated incidents. They were sustained conflicts that drained resources and attention. Some lasted decades. The irony is unavoidable. Systems built on total control were constantly destabilized by the very people they sought to dominate. And every escalation made slavery more expensive, more fragile, and more dependent on violence. By the late 18th century, cracks were visible everywhere, not because enslavers had grown kinder, but because maintaining the system required levels of force that rivaled external wars. Armies meant to project power abroad were tied down at home. Budgets ballooned. Risk multiplied. This is where part one must end, because this is the moment history pivots. Slavery stands not as a settled institution, but as a fortress under siege. Its walls thick, its guards armed, its defenders terrified of what would happen if the gates ever failed. The pressure did not ease. It intensified. By the end of the 18th century, slavery had become something its architects never intended it to be, a system permanently on the brink of armed collapse. What had once relied on local patrols and sporadic force now demanded standing militias, rapid response units, naval interdiction, and intelligence networks that rivaled those used against foreign enemies. The scale alone was unprecedented. Entire colonial economies depended on the assumption that millions of people could be held indefinitely by fear. History was about to prove that assumption false. The Atlantic world was not just moving goods and people across oceans. It was exporting instability. Slave ships, often described as commercial vessels, were in practice carefully engineered platforms of control. Their layouts reveal priorities that have nothing to do with profit efficiency and everything to do with suppression. Narrow passageways limited movement. Barricades separated crew from captives. Weapon racks were positioned for immediate access. Crews trained specifically for internal violence, drilling responses to uprisings in confined spaces where panic could be fatal. Rebellion at sea was not rare. It was expected. Records from insurers and shipping companies speak openly about it. Premiums rose sharply on routes known for resistance. Captains were rewarded not just for delivery, but for preventing loss through insurrection. Some ships carried more weapons than small military transports. Yet even with all this preparation, enslaved people fought back. They attacked when storms masked noise. They used tools meant for survival as weapons. They coordinated across language barriers under conditions deliberately designed to prevent communication. Many uprisings failed. Some succeeded. But every attempt forced adaptation, redesign, and increased cost. On land, the problem grew even larger. As plantations expanded, so did the need for security. In regions where enslaved populations vastly outnumbered free settlers, control depended on constant readiness. Laws mandated armed service. Drills became routine. Alarm systems were installed using horns, bells, and signal fires. Patrol routes overlapped deliberately to prevent blind spots. These measures did not emerge from paranoia. They emerged from experience. Escaped enslaved people did not simply vanish into wilderness. They organized. They formed maroon communities, self-sustaining, armed, and strategically positioned in terrain hostile to conventional forces. Swamps, mountains, dense forests, and remote coastlines became sanctuaries not because they were empty, but because they were defensible. These communities were not passive refuges. They conducted raids. They gathered intelligence. They guided others to safety. They sabotaged infrastructure. In military terms, they functioned as insurgent cells operating behind enemy lines. Colonial responses were swift and brutal. Expeditions were launched with professional soldiers, trackers, and attack dogs. Supply depots were established. Bounties were offered. In some cases, entire campaigns were waged for years against groups numbering only in the hundreds. The imbalance of force did not guarantee victory. Terrain, motivation, and local knowledge repeatedly offset numerical superiority. This pattern is critical to understand. Slavery was not undone by moral awakening alone. It was destabilized by resistance that forced enslavers into a permanent defensive posture. Every fort built, every patrol expanded, every expedition launched was an admission of vulnerability. By the late 18th century, this vulnerability intersected with a new factor: industrial warfare. Firearms were no longer rare or unreliable. Muskets became standardized. Ammunition production increased. Training improved. These developments initially favored enslavers, who tightened control through superior firepower. But technology does not remain one-sided forever. Weapons were stolen, traded, captured, and smuggled. Knowledge spread. Enslaved fighters learned how to exploit reload times, limited visibility, and rigid formations. Night attacks became common. Ambush replaced confrontation. Poisoning of supplies targeted logistics rather than manpower. These were not random acts. They were adaptations. The most destabilizing revolts were those that combined numbers with strategy. Nowhere was this more evident than in the Caribbean, where plantation density and demographic imbalance created explosive conditions. When large-scale uprisings erupted, colonial forces discovered that repression at scale required resources comparable to external war. The Haitian Revolution is often reduced to symbolism or ideology. In reality, it was a prolonged, brutal military conflict involving European powers, professional armies, naval blockades, disease, and attrition. Victory did not come through speeches. It came through battlefield competence, exploitation of terrain, and the collapse of an enemy's ability to sustain operations. Casualty figures were staggering. Entire expeditionary forces were destroyed, not just by combat, but by logistics failures and environmental conditions. European armies trained for continental warfare found themselves unprepared for insurgency in hostile terrain against opponents fighting for survival. The lesson was not lost on other powers. Slavery had become a strategic liability. Defending it diverted troops, drained budgets, and exposed empires to external threats. Internal security consumed resources meant for expansion and defense. The cost-benefit calculation began to shift, not morally, but materially. This is a third truth rarely taught. Slavery began to collapse when it became too expensive to defend. Abolition, when it came, was framed as legal progress. But behind the legislation lay decades of bloodshed, suppression, and resistance. Former slave patrols did not disappear. They evolved. Security structures remained. Control adapted rather than vanished. And the people who forced this change, the fighters, organizers, scouts, and leaders who made slavery ungovernable, were rarely rewarded. Many died unnamed. Many were excluded from official histories. Their victories were absorbed into narratives that emphasized order and legality over conflict and sacrifice. By the early 19th century, slavery stood weakened but not defeated. Its defenders still held power. Its infrastructure still existed, but its foundations were cracked. not by enlightenment alone, but by relentless pressure applied from below. The final dismantling of slavery did not arrive as a single moment of justice. It arrived unevenly, violently, and often disguised as reform. By the 19th century, many governments had begun to understand a hard strategic reality. Slavery could no longer be sustained without committing to permanent internal warfare. The question was no longer whether slavery was moral or immoral. The question was whether it was survivable. In regions where abolition laws were passed, they were rarely enforced peacefully. Armed resistance did not vanish with legislation. In many places, it intensified. Former enslavers feared retribution. Formerly enslaved people feared betrayal. Militias were reinforced, not dissolved. Troops were stationed not to protect freedom, but to prevent chaos. Order, not justice, became the priority. The public record often presents emancipation as a clean transition. Contracts replaced chains. Wages replaced ownership. But beneath this surface, the same mechanisms of control persisted. Patrols were renamed. Surveillance adapted. Vagrancy laws criminalized movement. Forced labor returned through legal loopholes. The infrastructure of domination did not disappear. It evolved. This continuity was not accidental. Governments understood that sudden withdrawal of force could lead to uprisings, reprisals, and economic collapse. So they managed the transition the same way they had managed slavery itself, through controlled violence and selective enforcement. Those who had fought the hardest were the least likely to benefit. Across the Americas, the Caribbean, and parts of Africa, individuals who had organized resistance found themselves marginalized or targeted. Some were arrested under new laws. Some were pushed into exile. Others simply vanished from the record. Their usefulness ended once the system they opposed collapsed. Recognition was inconvenient. Memory was dangerous. History textbooks rarely explain why so many former slaveholding societies invested heavily in police forces and internal security immediately after abolition. The answer lies in continuity. These institutions were not new. They were direct descendants of slave patrols, plantation militias, and colonial garrisons. Their mission remained the same: control populations considered unstable or threatening. The world moved forward, but not evenly. In some regions, slavery ended formally but continued informally for decades. Debt bondage, forced apprenticeships, and coerced labor filled the gap. These systems required enforcement. 2. Armed men still stood watch. Courts still sided with property and power. Violence simply became quieter, bureaucratic, and harder to trace. And yet, something fundamental had changed. The myth of absolute control was broken. Once enslaved populations demonstrated that sustained resistance was possible, that empires could be bled, exhausted, and defeated. The psychological balance shifted. Slavery had always depended on inevitability, on the belief that resistance was futile. When that belief collapsed, the system lost its greatest weapon. This is why the end of slavery was followed by such intense efforts to rewrite history. Narratives shifted away from conflict and toward morality. Abolitionists were celebrated. Legislators were praised. Nations framed themselves as enlightened actors who had corrected past mistakes. The violent struggle that forced these changes was minimized or erased. It was safer to teach children about speeches than about uprisings, about laws and about war. But the record remains. Military budgets, deployment orders, casualty lists, insurance claims, fortification plans. These documents tell a consistent story. Slavery was never a stable institution. It was a prolonged emergency sustained through force. And it ended only when that force could no longer guarantee control. The individuals who made this possible rarely appear in monuments or national holidays. They were not generals or politicians. They were scouts guiding fugitives through hostile terrain, organizers coordinating revolts under constant threat of death, fighters learning tactics through trial and loss. They innovated under pressure, adapted to overwhelming odds, and paid the highest price. They did not fight for recognition. They fought to survive. In modern discussions of slavery, there is a tendency to flatten complexity, to reduce centuries of struggle into simple moral lessons. While morality matters, this approach obscures the reality of how change occurs. Systems built on violence do not dissolve peacefully. They are dismantled by pressure, resistance, and cost. Understanding this matters today, not to assign guilt, but to recognize patterns. Control systems do not vanish. They transform. Surveillance replaces chains. Legal mechanisms replace overt force. The language changes, but the logic often remains. Studying slavery as a militarized system reveals how power adapts under threat, and how resistance forces that adaptation. This is a true story rarely taught, not because it is unknown, but because it is uncomfortable. It challenges the idea that progress is inevitable or benevolent. It shows that freedom is contested, fought for, and often won at tremendous cost by people whose names we may never know. The legacy of slavery is not just suffering. It is resistance. It is innovation under oppression. It is the proof that even the most heavily defended systems can be broken when those within refuse to accept inevitability. If the story moved you, challenged you, or made you reconsider what you were taught, then question other simplified narratives as well. History is rarely clean, but it is always instructive if we are willing to look at it honestly.